before we actually get started talking about what support engineering is and some best practices to support your developers, I want to start with a quick story. When I was in college, which was actually quite a bit ago, I had a job working at a theme park. I don't know how many of you are from Texas. How many of you have heard of Six Flags? Yeah, so I used to work at a Six Flags in Houston, which I think it's closed by now. But even though that theme park is gone, there was one thing that really stuck with me working there, and that was the customer-centric approach that they had to everything they did. They were very much all about the consumer and about creating a positive experience for customers. And one thing that they taught us on orientation day, I've honestly forgotten most about what I did at that job, but I did not forget this. They said, if a customer comes up to you and they ask you a question, you don't just say, I don't know, and just walk away. They said, if you don't know the answer to something, you say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. And that's something that has stuck with me and has sort of been at the core of who I am as an employee. And it sort of guided my work ethic pretty much my whole life. And I feel like this is part of what's at the core of being a good support engineer. So what is support engineering? To me, support engineering means developers helping other developers. So in my case, this means supporting the API. In this case, it's Context.io. We're an API for email. So we have developers that are wanting to integrate email typically into an existing application. So what this means is that we're helping them integrate with something, and we want to make it as painless as possible. And the nature of the support tickets are really more technical in nature. Sometimes they're about troubleshooting. Sometimes someone has actually discovered a bug. So it's really, again, developers helping other developers. So what I want to talk about today is support engineering best practices. Based on what I have seen from teams, I also have a background in support working for a gaming company. That was my first job ever working in tech, was working in support for a gaming company. So I've also learned a lot about how other companies in other industries handle support. So a lot of the patterns that I'm talking about here are drawing from both of those experiences. So I'm going to talk about continuity as it relates to support tickets or issues. I'm going to talk about ownership of those issues from your team. And I'm also going to talk about boundaries that you can help your team set so that they can be more successful. So to start with, talking about continuity. And here I want to talk about specifically the continuity of the support issues that might arise in, say, some sort of ticketing queue. So what I see from API teams is a couple of things. There's two different patterns that I see teams implement when it comes to support. One of them is dedicated, the other one is rotating support. So dedicated support typically means you have one person or maybe a group of people just handling support day to day. That is their job, to answer emails or chats from the support queue. The other pattern that I see is rotating support. So this means someone in your team handles support either for the week or maybe for the sprint. And this rotates typically either on a schedule like, say, on-call schedule or something like that. Some teams don't want to have the same person that is on-call also handle a support ticketing queue because that's a lot. But it really depends on the size of your team. Typically, the rotating support pattern is what I usually see in smaller teams that can't really afford to have dedicated support people to handle the support queue. So what I do want to talk about is why I think rotating support doesn't quite work, and how if you do have to implement this type of support pattern, how you could make it work. So why support rotation doesn't work? I feel like typically there's little to no follow through between tickets. So sometimes, a ticket comes in the queue, you're doing your support rotation, and if the issue takes longer than your support rotation to solve, and there's no way to really hand off to someone else, what I often see is that that ticket just kind of falls through the cracks. And that was actually a pain point that we had in my team when I first came in. When I opened up our support queue, there were tickets from 2015, 2014 that just were never followed through because someone was on support that week and then they just kind of forgot about it the next week once they were no longer on support. So I feel like that sort of rotation can encourage people to just kind of drop those tickets and not really follow through once they're not in support. Also, it's not always clear how to do handoffs from one ticket to another, especially if you're dealing with a very problematic type of bug or issue that someone has brought up to your attention that's going to require maybe more than a week of work. It can be hard to try to pass that on to another teammate. And then what ends up happening if there are no handoffs, or if there is a handoff, there can be ownership confusion as to who is going to end up owning the response back to the customer. Is it you that originally did it? Is it the person that solved it? Sometimes these things can be hard to codify. There's also efficiencies lost due to the time to ramp up. So if you have one person only doing support maybe 1 week out of the month or 1 week every 2 months, there's always going to be a little bit of time for them to get back into the groove of things, back into remembering what things do we have macros for, what was this thing that, how do I fix it? Is there a tool for that? There's always efficiencies are going to be lost when people have to relearn how to do the job. So these are reasons why I feel like a support rotation doesn't really tend to work. And unfortunately, that's what most teams that are small, that are handling an API, typically end up doing because they just don't really have the resources to have a dedicated person doing support. So how support rotation can work is to try to prioritize those support issues as they arise. One pain point that we had at my team was that when we had a support issue come through, we would often create a card and put it in our backlog, but once it made it to our backlog, it got lost. And then it would be 5 months later, and we never actually ended up solving the issue. And then whoever brought it up to our attention, we lost that customer. And that's just a very sure way for things to sort of get lost. So one thing that we had to get in the mindset of doing is if you have a production support issue come through during your support rotation, you bubble it up, but you make sure that it gets put into an active sprint. And that's what's worked for us, not really drop those issues on the floor. And yes, it's going to impact your active sprint, obviously, but we've made sure to account for that within our points. We always budget for time for things we didn't know, and that's how we've been able to try to keep those issues more at the forefront so that they don't just fall through the cracks. And lastly, if it happened on your rotation, you still own it, and this is something that we've needed to codify. So if someone is on support duty and they are troubleshooting an issue that spans longer than their support rotation, they still own it and they still have to get back to the customer with a solution. That way there's a little bit more of that ownership and continuity for the work. So this is why I feel dedicated support really works well in this case, is because you have that business continuity. You can find efficiencies from that business continuity. So if you are owning the tickets and this is all you do is answering those questions, you tend to familiarize yourself with the developers that are using your products. You find patterns from the issues that arise day to day. From those patterns, you can find efficiencies. So this means that you can write macros or write tools that facilitate or automate your support job. And from this, you can also do a lot of relationship building. So this means that if you know your developers that are using your API and they know you, that relationship is that much stronger. When we switched to doing dedicated support, we saw an increase in satisfaction from our developers. We had developers who said, we considered using your competitor, but your support is so much better than theirs that we decided to stick with you. And I feel like if you take the time to have someone be dedicated to support and nurture those customer relationships, you'll really see that shine with your relationship building with your customers. However, if you do decide to go with dedicated support, you do want to have an exit strategy for your team members. What I see a lot of teams do once they decide that they want to do dedicated support is that they find a junior engineer to come in and be a support engineer. And I think that's a great way to recruit a junior developer and have them learn your application, have them learn the product before they even really touch code. You teach them how to debug, you teach them how to troubleshoot, you teach them how to do logs, how to read logs and interpret them. That's an art. And if you can teach them that, you're gonna have a really great developer in your hands. So that's what I see a lot of teams nowadays doing with support engineering, but the problem is that often they don't offer a way for them to level up. And this is where you start seeing burnout. So if you are going to go through and implement a dedicated support type of team and have one person be dedicated to that, make sure that you do have an exit strategy so that they don't just end up burning out. The second thing that I want to talk about is ownership and escalations of support issues. I see two patterns again. One I call removed, and the other one I call owned. These are terms that I made up. These are not terms that exist anywhere, so I just want to clarify that. Removed escalations is a pattern that maybe some of you have seen. There's an issue, and it's actually an issue on someone else's team's side that they need to fix, so you throw it over the fence. And what happens with these types of escalations is that the person actually implementing the solution doesn't really get to talk to the customer, so the impact is kind of lost on them. And what ends up happening is that they don't prioritize that work. This is why I feel like oftentimes with the removed escalations, you lose that sense of priority when you throw things over the fence. And the person implementing the solution is not really personally accountable to the end user, and they're also not being graded on an SLA. So if I'm actually answering the customer, say on Zendesk, however time that ticket is open, that's what you're being graded on as a support engineer. And if you have to throw it over the fence to someone else for something to fix, they're not being graded on how long that ticket is open. They're only being graded on whether or not they finish that work. So this is why sometimes it can be really lost on the other developer how pressing it is to get something done or get a production support issue done. And there's really not a better way to solve for this than to communicate. You need to be able to express to the other teams how important it might be to solve something, because the truth is that if the other team doesn't really get to see the impact to the end customer, they might just not care as much. So you need to really increase communication to make sure you let the other team know how important it is for something to get fixed. The pattern that I see that I feel works best is owned escalations, when another team has to fix an issue, but they ultimately own the reply to the end user. Why this works is because there's better business continuity and better tracking. So if I actually assign this person to reply back to the end user, you're putting the client front and center in that interaction. You're also losing the middleman, because if I'm owning all of the communication with the customer and I have to interface with another team, again, they don't keep that customer front and center. So if you actually are able to have the other person own the reply, you're building the relationship and you're keeping that customer front and center. And this increases accountability for the other team. So if the other team knows that they have to get back to the customer with a solution, and they know they are responsible for implementing the solution, they're much more likely to want to get it done quicker, because the longer they wait, the more they're going to have to be a little bit apologetic about how long it took. So typically, whenever we do this type of escalation in my team and we let the other person know, hey, you are responsible for the communication ultimately with the end user once you solve this issue, we've seen that they're just much more likely to get that done quicker and to also get the information that they need from the end user without having to act with a middleman. And that has made our support issues be faster to find a resolution for. The last thing that I want to talk about is boundaries, because this is often something that we don't talk a lot about when it comes to support engineering and with your team. I think it's really important to set really good boundaries with either your customers or the developers that are using your API. One of the things that I see happen a lot, and one of the things that I feel leads to burnout when you're doing support engineering, is that some teams don't stick to business hours. So say you are a small company based in the US, you can only do support, say, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Central Time, but if you have, say, Zendesk feed into your Slack, you're seeing tickets come in at all hours of the day, and oftentimes the temptation to just go in there and answer a ticket real quick can be very appealing because it's just a quick answer. But what ends up happening is that you teach bad habits to your end users. So what ends up happening is that you think you're being nice and you're doing them a favor by answering a question outside of business hours, and then once you're not there during business hours because you actually are doing something outside of work, then it opens your team up for failure because you're not enforcing those hours. So I think it's really important to actually stick to that and really let your team know, hey, it's going to be this time, that's all we can do, and really do also take care of yourself. Because otherwise, again, it can lead to burnout because doing support engineering is really tough. You're dealing with people that have found an issue and they are frustrated, sometimes they're angry. So it's a tough job. Protect your team by ensuring that they're not always answering questions when they're not supposed to. Now, it might be different for you. This really is what I see a point of failure for small teams. But if you have a big team and you can afford to have different coverage throughout the day, 24/7, that's great. You also want to allow buffer time between responses. So what I see a lot of the times is that some developers don't read our docs. So one thing we've learned is that if we allow a little bit of buffer time before that first reply, we'll let them know, hey, we're taking a look. But a lot of the times, allowing that auto reply to say, hey, take a look at the docs, gets rid of a lot of the questions because they'll just go look at the docs and they answer their own questions. So allowing for that buffer has really helped us. Lastly, you want to reinforce good behavior. I wanted to share this, and I'll just let you read that for a sec. This is a real email that we got, and I felt that as a team member, I needed to address this real quick. Now, here's my reply, and I said, hey, I'm the lead support engineer. I'm not. I'm a software engineer, but sometimes people like titles, and I was the first support engineer, so I kind of just have been saying I'm the lead whenever someone kind of needs that escalation, like, ooh, I got to a boss, but I'm not, but I was just kind of using that as a tactic. And I said, hey, I'm going to address your question, but I also want to address your behavior. It's not cool how you talked. It's not cool. This goes to all of our developers, and we are not going to tolerate this type of behavior. We have no issues banning anybody from our API because we don't want this person to continue to abuse our team. And this is really important. So I felt really backed by my team because I was able to write that question, and I felt empowered to write it because protecting my team was more important to me. And I really feel like your team's sanity and happiness definitely comes first, especially when you're dealing with emails like this, because support engineering can be hard from that perspective. So you want to make sure that you do have your team's back and that you empower them to be able to say, hey, you know what, this is not cool. You really want to protect your team. Otherwise, again, they'll burn out. It's a difficult job. However, I feel like after everything we've talked about so far, talking about different patterns and how they might work, prioritizing a culture of support engineering also means prioritizing a good engineering culture within your organization. Thank you.